I began my career as a research and news writer. I worked for a local newspaper. And I was always interested in sort of unusual subjects and topics. Growing up, I read a lot of Stephen King. I watched a lot of Twilight Zone and a lot of old horror movies. I was always interested in that. And at one point, I was trying to find a book that sort of brought all the different ideas of the afterlife into one volume, so that instead of, if I wanted to learn about, let's say I wanted to learn about hell, it used to be I'd have to get some religious books to learn about what they said about it. And then I'd have to get some myth books to see Greek myth, Egyptian myth, Babylonian. The pop culture, I would just sort of have to search through sort of likely topics like horror movies. This was, of course, before the internet. There was, you can just type in a keyword and come up with stuff. Well, I couldn't find a book like that. So I decided I would try to write one. And that was my first books really were Encyclopedia of Heaven and Hell. I'd originally envisioned it as one volume, but when it got to the publisher, they decided to split it into two because there was just so much going on. It just made more sense. So those were my first two books that came out. They came out right around I think one came out in 1998, and the other came out in 1999. But I started researching them back in the early to mid 90s, when research really back then was libraries, books, talking to actual sources, trying to find a friend of a friend who might have like an old video I could watch that I'd heard about. Maybe it had a scene about hell, but there was no Netflix back then. So while I was writing the hell book, I did come upon a lot of material that I didn't feel comfortable including in my books at the time. Some of it didn't exactly fit because it was more about Satan or about, horrible crimes or whatever. But then other things, I didn't want to read it here in the news someday that somebody did something terrible to an animal or a child or whatever and said, oh, I got the idea from this book. So I sort of kept all those notes aside. And as I've learned as a research writer, never throw anything away. So I still have all my notes. I still have all my notes going back to the news stories I did back in the 80s.
Was it like ritualistic type shit?
Yeah, there were a lot of, most of the really dark things, the darkest of the things I should say would be, crimes. And it wasn't real. It wasn't people who really were Satanists doing it. It would be some teenager or some crazy person or some, it was always something. And they would do this saying, oh, I'm doing a satanic ritual. I'm doing a sacrifice or whatever. But it wasn't in any sort of organized fashion, but some of it was really brutal, really, really brutal. So I saved all those notes. And then I talked to some other people too, a lot of very nice people. I talked to different priests and rabbis and shamans and imams and clerics. And so it sort of spanned the gamut. And even some of the things they told me, they had a lot of really interesting stories, but it didn't really fit. My topic was descriptions of the physical place of hell. So it wasn't this particular demon or this particular person who supposedly was damned, unless they had a story like of going to hell. If it involved hell, the place, then I would include it in the book. But some of the things just didn't quite fit. So I kept them. And then years later, that's a lot of the source material I used when I was writing Bandun Gate.